Who do I have to pass the mic on? Sorry, I don't remember. Sorry, just a shot. A shot. Cool. Well, welcome to the IDB Pavilion of the Americas, where we turn conversation into action. We'll start with our event, Indigenous Solution for Global Problems. I will let Akashi do the opening remarks. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? I'm hoping that I can project my voice above the other panels that we can hear, but I want to welcome you to the launch of the Minimum Regulatory Function report by the Caribbean Development Bank. And we know we have a short time, so we're not going to spend a lot of time doing introductions, but I want to welcome to the floor our Vice President of Operations, Mr. Isaac Solomon, who will bring greetings on behalf of management and staff of the bank. Isaac?
Okay. Thank you very much, Ashaki, and good morning, everyone. I first want to start by thanking the IDB for allowing us to have this event here. And I also want to thank all of you for making it to this session, given the varying competing assignments and events here at COP28. So I think it is fair to say that virtually all Caribbean countries are fully committed to transitioning their energy sectors away from reliance on fossil fuels for domestic markets. These commitments are clearly reflected in their national energy policies and their nationally determined commitment targets. It is also fair to say, however, that there are large gaps between the ambitious commitments and the observed current slow pace of renewable energy penetrations. Since it has been long established that the mammoth investments required must come from the private sector, it can be concluded that the gaps can be attributed to the absence of private sector investments. This conclusion begs answers to two related questions. The first is, why is there insufficient investment being made in renewable energy by the private sector? A common, long-standing and recurring reason remains that the electricity sector regulatory frameworks are weak and hence inadequate to engender the confidence of private sector renewable energy investors. The second question, why don't countries take the relevant steps to address their weak regulatory frameworks which have persisted over time? We have concluded that some key reasons could be that the process of establishing an appropriate regulatory framework for each country is complex, involving multiple actors at the national levels, and is often characterized by uncertainty about what constitutes the right mix of measures to be implemented or prioritized. It also requires specialized technical skills. The concept of a minimum regulatory function has been identified to address this challenge by providing a practical tool to help simplify the complex multi-actor context and to assist in addressing the challenge of uncertainty in relation to the right mix of regulatory measures to be pursued. The MRF is presented as a set of critical ingredients which, if fully present in any Caribbean country, will constitute the threshold conditions or framework which will likely give private renewable energy investors sufficient confidence to invest. It is therefore meant to be a practical tool to assist countries to take key steps. It is not meant to be a panacea or to be an all and all. In fact, Some countries have some components in place and exceed others. However, we are proposing that all countries need to have at least these elements as a minimum. In the interest of time, I will not get into the specifics here, as the presentation and discussion to follow will explore the details of the MRF. We believe that if our 19 borrowing member countries, or BMCs as we refer to them, were to implement these key elements, there would be a significant scaling up of renewable energy investments across the countries. In this regard, it is considered an important dimension of the bank's energy sector strategy, referred to as the Accelerated Sustainable Energy and Resilience Asset 2030 framework, which is focused on assisting countries to speed up and scale up renewable energy investments. Adoption of the MRF by BMCs will also better enable the bank to target its resource mobilization efforts and to work strategically with partners to meet the financing requirements by private investors. It therefore gives me great pleasure to officially launch this minimum regulatory function publication as a tool to assist Caribbean countries to scale up and speed up investments in renewable energy. CDB is extremely proud to present the MRF, a demonstration of innovation and knowledge creation, which are central to our vision of development for our region. I encourage all BMCs and partners to join us as we seek to encourage the application of this tool to identify gaps and support the strengthening of the electricity regulatory frameworks in the region and transform practice. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Isaac, for bringing these brief introductory remarks. Before we start off with the panel discussion, we're going to have the head of our renewable energy unit, Mr. Joseph Williams, just to help to further set the context of this report. But before we do that, I also wanted to acknowledge our panelists who are here with us. Of course, our partners from the IDB and CAF. Increasingly over the last few months, the bank has been building on our partnerships with other development banks in the region, and we can't do this alone. And today we will speak a bit more about how we can support each other in this space. So Joseph will give us a few slides. We know that the time is tight, and we really want the opportunity to engage with our panelists and to engage with you as the audience. Joseph?
Okay, good morning. Good morning all. So I'm just proposing to just present a few slides just to help to create the context and build on what Vice President Solomon just mentioned. So, thank you. Okay, yes. Okay, thanks. There we go. So, I think the status quo is well known. We don't need to spend a lot of time talking about this. We understand the risks based on where we are as a region in terms of our overdependence. We understand that we have lots of resources. And what we do know is that the countries are committed, but this commitment is not really reflected in the pace of the transition. And if you were to translate working back from targets, what needs to be done, it's really what some people would describe as a humongous task. So that we know, the bank's energy sector policy and strategy rests on 4 broad pillars, and one of them has to do with improving the governance framework environment that to enable private sector participation and investments in sustainable energy options. And this is critical because it is well understood, accepted, as VP said, that it's really the resources investment really need to come from the private sector. It's really private sector investment that's going to drive the transition. And it's in that context of the slow pace, the fact that we have to do a lot of things differently, we have to take bold actions, and it requires a different kind of conversation that we have developed what is known as the ASSERT framework. And in a nutshell, it has three broad elements shown on the right-hand side. It's about bringing together all the key stakeholders in a very short time space, but deep consultation, reflective of very strong diagnosis and an assessment to build on what we know already. It's not about starting from scratch. It's about how we move to the next level. But this piece is very, very, very important because it is important that we have all the key stakeholders at the table, bringing all the information, the experience we have around the specific challenge that we are going to be targeting in whatever area. So that dialogue is not just another conference or meeting and so on. It's very carefully designed. It's very important that we have the BMCs, but all the partners, stakeholders in country at the table as we seek to tackle the difficult challenges in those areas. And then out of that, we come up with transformative intervention that we have called assertives. And the question then becomes, how do we resource it? And the answer, we think, is in the context of partnership, because no one institution has all the resources in terms of volume, but also in terms of the appropriate fit for purpose resources. So that has to be critical. But it's not just partnership again in a general way. It's about partnership targeted at the specific problem. So we could be working with IDB on many things, or CAF. The question is, on this particular issue that we're looking at in this assert challenge, that we're building the assertive around, what are the resources, what are the unique resources that IDB or CAF or World Bank has to really help us to kick this challenge in a big way? So it's very focused, very targeted, because it's not just business as usual. And so that framework is really trying to help us to do that. Two quick things I want to mention. One, we think CDB is well placed to facilitate this role because of our membership footprint in the region. So there's quite a bit of learning that we can leverage. So some countries don't have access to some resources, some partners, but because we're in the middle, we can help to bridge those gaps. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that we have a fairly strong knowledge of some of the issues in the region, and in that context can help to build those bridges. Okay, so we have identified some initially big areas for interventions, right? So some of them we have already been working on. The idea is not to do something new necessarily. The idea is, if this is a big area of potential, how can we address the barriers that have been identified? And that's why the dialogue is so important, because dialogue is very targeted to understand the specific barriers and how we are going to dismantle them. Very, very targeted approach. To cut it short, so we have a number of areas that we have identified, but one of them is the regulatory framework, and I've highlighted that in yellow. This one has been a long-standing, sticking, stubborn issue. It has been in the dialogue for more than 15 years as a big issue that needs to be addressed. And the question is, why are we making progress in this area? And so we have had the dialogue around that, and we have said, look, one of the issues has to do with, we had a dialogue last year, February, the ASSERT dialogue, and we had over 80 participants, 13 regulators, 17 of our BMCs represented, and about 12 international partners. I have the region, yes. So it was highly consultative, broad stakeholder participation and ownership. And out of that, one of the issues that emerged was that, look, this issue of the framework is elusive, it's challenging because of the nature of it. It varies per country. Some of the instruments are difficult to even apply, to identify what is relevant to the countries. And as VP identified clearly in his comments, it's a complex and moving and challenging situation. So the dialogue came up with the idea that if we were able to come up with this minimum function, and we have chosen those words carefully because we're not necessarily saying that that's a framework for everybody, but these functions could be applied in a way that it becomes the basic elements in each country that creates a framework for private investment. In other words, if some key things are there, even though other things need to be worked on, then we should be able to get the ball moving in these countries. And that is the idea here. And so it is seen as a significant step because it hopefully can be applied in a manner that can help to simplify things and allow for actions to take place, right? A lot of time the lack of action has to do with the fact that limited capacity with the policy makers and so many things to be done, so many decisions, they're not too sure where to start and where to get the resource. And so we're trying to address that gap. And so the publication seeks to capture that, and it's available. Was published in October. We're officially putting it out now as a, the official launch of it, but it has been out there already. And essentially, I just spent a couple minutes just to talk about this and sit down. So, what we're saying is that planning framework is a critical part. The IRP is an important part given how the sectors have evolved. Where the country wants to go in terms of building out its capacity and all the issues around the sector is an important part to give a sense of stability and a sense of a direction and some certainty. And the IRP is an important part. We can talk about it. That issue of the procurement and financing mechanism is a critical part. We label it that way, but it could be things like the grid feeding mechanism, whether or not we're going to go, like in the case of Jamaica, public auction, or you're going to do some feeding net billing mechanism. We tend not to want to go with net billing in the region for many reasons. We can talk about that. But whatever the mechanism, it needs to be very clear. So anybody at any scale within the investment profile can have clarity around how they want to invest or get in the space. And then the whole question of access and the environmental permits and the planning permits and who is responsible for what and what steps to be taken and whether or not the resources are in certain zones and so on. All clarity around that is very important for investors. And the question of the distributed generation framework, that is relevant to all countries, especially because of the solar option. And we think that's a big element because it takes a big part of your populace that may not be large investors. Finally, I just want to touch on the utility side. The utility is the off-taker. And so the question is whether or not they can play their part to pay for to pay the off-take and so on. And that comes back to the health of the utility. Also come back to clarity around the tariff. And so those elements need to be supported and be very clear and be strengthened in order for you to have a framework. So we have put forward, out of research, experience, and strong advice, deep consultation, these are some basic elements. Beyond each of these are a lot of narrative and guidelines and so on and what needs to be done. But in the interest of time, I'll just mention those comments in relation to that. So those are the main elements we have articulated based on the research that we have done and the experiences we have had. So I will stop here for the conversation, but the publication can be accessed and we can share the information beyond this point. Thank you so much.
Joe, thank you very much, and let me congratulate you and your team for all the work that you have been doing in this space over the last few years, not just about presenting on energy, but how it relates to the regular man, how it relates to us, how it relates to the other sectors that the bank has been investing in. And I want to throw open the floor now because we have lots of questions, two each, for our panelists. And I'm going to start on the partnerships part of things. And some argue that the matter of creating an enabling framework for private investment is largely a governance issue. Governments have to take the lead and make the commitment to take relevant actions. Do you agree? I'm going to start with Graham from IDB. What, if any, are the roles of international development partners like IDB, CDB, and CAF for encouraging governments to go in this direction? Graham?
Hello. So, first of all, I'm going to announce that I'm not an energy person. So I just want to put everybody on the same table. I'm a climate person. Secondary, I want to congratulate you guys because I think this is a big step forward and it's a very important step forward. Perhaps in this discussion we're going to talk a little bit about where the resources are going to come from, but I think one of the points you guys made is it's clear that it's either public or private resources that are going to have to move this agenda forward. I like the reference to speed and scale. There's a great book written on speed and scale, if you maybe you've read it, which I think is a very important addition in terms of moving forward. And I love the focus on regulations, changing regulations, because this is what we're also finding in terms of decarbonization processes. So where we have been working is trying to help countries work through the process of decarbonization at a broad sense. And what we found is if you don't have participation, nothing happens. So there are many examples, not just in Latin America and the Caribbean, but globally, where the Ministry of Environment develops the long-term strategy or the NDC and never talks to anybody else, even in the government, let alone beyond the government. When that happens, you get a nice document and you put it on the shelf and it stays there and nothing happens at all. So participation is critical. If you're talking about the Caribbean, you're talking about energy, then the participation of the companies that are the generators is crucial, but also actually the households, the homes. It goes all the way down to that level. So it's actually a fully participatory process, and it needs to involve all of the actors to be able to move the agenda forward. And it's particularly complex in the Caribbean. There are questions of economies of scale in the Caribbean with respect to higher costs, which are challenging. There are the huge questions of environmental vulnerability. So one of the issues we talk a lot with our energy guys is how do you manage, how do you create resilience in these systems as well? It's an added complexity that you don't necessarily have in mainland systems. There are human development challenges, institutional challenges. Most of the islands have relatively small populations. It's hard to create the broader frameworks that you can get in Brazil, in Barbados, where you have 250,000 people. So, and you have the points you mentioned, which I think is the driving force behind this, the question of the dependence on fossil fuels and the lack of security that gives you. So I think you have the urgency thing about driving the change forward. So that's great. Why our interest and our shared interest in regulatory systems? There are a lot of changes happening. Many of these systems are based on new technologies. They're not based on the history. It's different. So we do have to rethink how we're doing things. From listening to you, it's also that we need to improve these regulatory systems anyway. But not only you have to improve them, but you have to change them because there's new stuff, there's new kids on the block. So there are new things that need to be done. You mentioned auctions, you mentioned permitting, that those kinds of issues are crucial to being able to bring in renewable energy into the systems, and we found that not just in the Caribbean, but everywhere. You need rules for dispatch. You need to address those kinds of questions as well. Tariff structures you mentioned, and energy efficiency standards. So a lot of this is regulatory. And if you create the regulations the right way, then you're going to encourage renewables. If you keep them the same way they have been for the last 50 years, nothing's going to happen in the system. And then last point I'd like to make is on standardizing across the region. Coming back to that economy of the scale problem, if Trinidad and Tobago's system is different from Barbados' system, is different from Jamaica's system, it's going to make it difficult to draw in private sector because you've got a very small market in each of those areas. And if you want to scale investments, ultimately, private sector is going to get more interested if it's a larger investment than if it's a smaller investment. It's also complex if you want to bring in technologies. Because if you bring in technologies, you have to make agreements with the groups coming in. So it's doubly complex in the sense of bringing in private sector. I think also that you can kind of use countries to work with each other and against each other. So if country A does it, then country B will look at that and look at the lessons learned, and then maybe we'll also do it and then move forward. So you can start with pilots and actually move the agenda forward probably quicker than you would do if you started just with a single country. You also levelize the playing fields, so you don't get everything going to one country versus another country, and it reduces transactional costs for companies as well. So I think for all of those reasons, and hopefully I've answered your question, I mean, why are these enabling systems important? But That's our view. And I repeat, this is not a view from an energy sector person. This is more of a view of somebody that is trying and has a team that's trying to drive change in countries. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Graham. Mauricio, can you weigh in on this one?
Thanks a lot. Okay. As CAF, we work in the Latin American region and also in the Caribbean. And we have been working in energy for around more than 50 years, 53 years exactly. We like this exercise that you have made, trying to put a bunch of regulatory norms and to create some tools in order to have a better report. This is something that we want to do and we want to support in the region. In general, we want to establish some facilities, or facilities is not the word, I'm not the English speaker, rather we want to make easier the operations with our clients. We want to give them some easy reports and formats and easier tools in order to create some homogeneous mass of knowledge and homogeneous mass of information that we can process internally, and to assess finally if the energy projects are successful or not. We want to increase the participation, and this exercise trying to create some regulatory function report is, I will say that's an example, because the conditions of the Caribbean countries are for sure different of conditions of Andean countries that are the founders of CAF. We are expanding to the Caribbean in the last years. We want to be there, and we need to learn also how to work better with Caribbean countries. What are the needs? And this type of panel and exchange of ideas, and also we are learning a lot how to improve that work and to bring this type of investments and finance in Caribbean countries. So our team of energy, because I'm not from that team, is happy to have this type of tools, information and knowledge born and that incorporate the opinion of the users, native users. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mauricio. So our takeaway here is that the dialogue has to continue beyond COP. IDB, CAF, CDB, this is a collaboration in the energy space that we need to continue, not just from providing policy support to governments, but how we can also coordinate with increasing financing for the space. And this goes to our second question, and maybe our last question given the time constraints. Inadequate finance has been floated as a major issue for Caribbean countries, and is something that we have heard about increasingly so during this COP. The need for adequate and accessible financing for our SIDS. How does this barrier compare with the barrier of inadequacy of an enabling and regulatory framework. So we have on one side the issue of financing, and then on the other side we have that we need an enabling framework for the energy transition to take place. So colleagues, I invite you to weigh in. Joe, I see you smiling, so I'm going to ask you to weigh in first, and then I'll hand over to Mauricio, then Graham, and perhaps you can also use this as your wrapping up final words to the audience.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ashaki. So, you know, most times when you speak to an audience about the challenges with investing in energy in the space, the matter of financing comes up, right, as a key one of the challenges that the different actors face, you know, potential investors. And when we say investors, obviously, the spectrum. Could be the small householders who want to participate in this transition and so on, as well as an international investor maybe, or a regional or local investor. So when I say investor, I mean broadly. So the question is always about, you know, finance and then access to finance and so on. And I think there are some really good cases there. I mean, people can point to real issues depending on the type of funding and the scale and so on. But based on our own analysis internally in CDB, we have come to the conclusion that the single biggest issue is really in that governance, regulatory, legal framework. The single biggest issue. We're not suggesting that the financing is not a big issue, but to the extent that you're able to solve that or make progress in that area, you're going to find that many of the issues around financing kind of diminish. Not all, but I'm just suggesting. And I give an example. So you take a large-scale project, and if there's no clarity around the procurement, the PPA, and so on, most of those issues have to be settled in the context of the contract. Because if the framework is not clear, then the negotiation becomes that much more complex in trying to ensure that those risks are captured in the contract between the parties, in some cases between the investor and the utility. And so that you end up with is a protracted or unnecessarily long protracted negotiation process, which has been the case for many projects throughout the region. And so I argue, before you even get to trying to go and get to financial closure, you have a long gestation around the negotiations and so on. And so people say, well, it's because they can't get the financing. But really, some of those issues come back to that framework issue, right? And I could cite a few others. So my point here is, if we were able to make sufficient progress in that governance space, and I use governance now broadly because some of it is still at the level of what is permitted by law. So for example, in some cases you can't generate and integrate with the grid. So broadly, if we were able to make more progress there, I think some of the financing issues and so on would be diminished. And in that context, I would say, for us, that remains the biggest issue. Not to say that the financing and access is not significant, but that remains the biggest issue. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I just came from a meeting with McKinsey and other actors of consultant and private sector, and we were just talking about energy transition, and of course there are several indicators about how to make it well, and legal normative is something that is needed. It has to be clear. It has to be also just and also incorporate several other factors that can affect the well-being and the fairness of this process. So basically, we were talking about a case in Colombia how they can do just energy transition with the resources that they have. They are a country that is not rich, but it's not also a least developing country. It's right in the middle. And well, they were mentioning that the tools that they have to use right now are not the tools that they need, because they are a producer of coal. They have exports of coal, but that helps them to finance everything, not only their transition to energy. And right now they don't have, they consider that they don't have a tool or a mechanism to measure how just is the transition, because they are incorporating the cost of that coal into the whole exercise. And some other indicators and and possibility for making this exercise improving was introducing several socioeconomic indicators in that measurement. Well, basically, we are still with some doubt about how to make it well. We are spending some resources in order to have a methodology, but we, of course, celebrate that some methodologies like the one that you have in the Caribbean can help and give some food to this exercise, some nice inputs in order to measure better that just energy transition.
Thanks, Mauricio. Graham, we're going to give you the final word.
Okay, thanks. So, firstly, on the enabling conditions, I would look at it as a process of change. So, as a process of change, you explained that I think we've got the urgency, the commitment, and that's step one. But what we actually need is a very clear vision about where we want to go. So that's part of the planning process. You need to have that in place, particularly when you've got new technologies. So you have to evaluate those to see which ones fit, which ones don't fit. You need that clarity of purpose to go through multiple governments. It needs to be a state policy, it needs to be a state plan, not a political plan. We've found in several countries that a country, or even a subnational, can go one way and then suddenly decide it's going another way. United States being a good example of this. So you don't want that to happen, because you want clarity over the long term to give clarity to the private sector about what direction you're going in. And you need the analytical work, which you're putting in place here, to be able to say, this is where you want to go, this is what you want to think about, here's the guidelines on how to move forward. We have some examples of this kind of change. We're still learning ourselves, but take, for example, electric buses in Chile. When you try to implement electric buses, actually you need to change the regulations, because the bus costs 5 times as much money as it did before. So now the operators of the bus can't buy the bus. Somebody else has to buy the bus, but that means you have to change the whole system. So if you change the system, you open the door, and then you can get private sector involved, and you can move the agenda forward. But if you don't do that, it doesn't happen. The point on the just transition is crucial, because somebody is going to win and somebody's going to lose in that game, and that needs to be managed. So that's change. That's how you look at change. We've also found that if you can get pilots to go, to show the way forward, that's a very useful. Those are quick wins, right? If you have a quick win, then somebody else will follow in and they'll come behind and be able to move it forward. And you need to communicate a lot about that. You need to share the information about that. If you don't do that, then it could be a quick win, but nobody knows it's a quick win, so nothing happens. So that on the change side of thing. I wanted to add some of the access to finance, other access to finance problems. One of them is there's an overdependence on thinking that the international climate funds are going to solve things. Everybody thinks there's a bucket of money out there, but just do the math. Sorry, that's very American. Do the mathematics. if you actually ask the question, okay, let's say there's $4 billion annually available. There's 150 developing countries. How much money is that you got in your hand? It's actually $26 million. That's going to do the job? That's the average. No. That's not the solution. That can help, it can drive transformation, and hence the focus on driving transformation. So that would be my first point. Plus, it's complicated to access these funds. It's very hard to execute these funds. So if you're going to jump in that bucket, just realize what they're for and how they work. There's a problem, as Avinash Persaud always mentioned, that if you've got investments that don't have sufficient revenue streams or have no revenue streams, like adaptation investments, it's very hard to get private sector involved. And if they're insufficient or they're not scaled enough, it's very complex. So we need to think about that. That's another major problem set. And the third problem set, I take a lot from Avinash actually, is risk, is perceived risk, and how you manage it. You mentioned the perceived risk issues, particularly perceived currency or foreign exchange risk. So we need to innovate, have mechanisms that allow us to actually dampen that risk, to manage that risk, to hedge the risk. In fact, one of the things we announced here at COP was the project, basically a program in Brazil to move the agenda forward to actually create a fund that can actually help manage those risks. What about one of those for the Caribbean? Once you can drop that risk, then, I mean, Avinash uses these numbers. I'm taking his name in vain, but he always says, in Germany, a renewable energy generation project costs you 5%. In Caribbean, 20%. Where's the private sector going to invest? So we have to be able to address that question. And we need a regional mechanism for addressing it. And I'm going to stop there and also just congratulate you guys again, because I think this is a really good way forward, and looking forward to working with you.
Thank you very much, panelists. I think I would call this a quick fireside chat that we were able to have on what are the ingredients that are necessary for us to move the needle. And we see it is not just finance, and it is not just having a predictable regulatory framework, but there are several things that have to come together. And I think underpinning that would be partnerships, coordination in this space, the support of public and the private sector. And with that, colleagues, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank the audience as well. VPO, thank you for being here with us. We know that the last few days we've all been running from events, but I think it's important for us to have these types of dialogues and to agree that the conversations don't stay here. The partnerships, they're not an event-focused idea, but how can we continue that and really to help the people who we are serving, the people in the region. So colleagues, thanks again for being here, and enjoy the rest of COP. Thank you.